Chapter 2, Police History, Part 5. We said at the end of the political era in the 1960s, we were realizing more and more that the police could be much better, that they were contributing to some of the unrest in society. By 1968, especially 1968, it's known as the Long Hot Summer. In 1968, we had riots in cities throughout the United States, in New York, LA, Newark, Detroit. So we had massive riots going on. The police were often certainly they weren't the sole cause of these riots, but some police action often was responsible for setting the riots off. And so Congress started holding hearings to discuss how to deal with crime generally, but also how to improve the police. And so one of the products of this time period was the LEAA. So this was the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. And so LEAA did a number of things. It was, as I said, created in 1968. It was eventually replaced by an agency with a different name in 1982, and that agency was replaced. We still have an agency that's doing the work of what LEAA did, assisting law enforcement, but it goes by a different name, and we're not going to worry about that name. But nonetheless, the LEAA created in the late 1960s funding for a lot of things. It provided money for police departments. They could apply for grants and get money for better equipment, improve their training, etc., etc. But it also, the LEAA provided money for research and education. So research into police and the practices of the police, and also education for those people who wanted to become police officers. One of the chief programs was LEAP. So I know this is starting to sound like alphabet soup because we had LEAA and now we have LEEP. The LEEP is the Law Enforcement Education Program. And so what this program did was it provided scholarships to people who wanted to become police officers. And so we wanted to have a better educated police force. In fact, LEAA surmised that by 1982 that every major police department would require a bachelor's degree as a minimum requirement for working as a police officer. Unfortunately, we're nowhere close to that. Now, bachelor degrees for police officers are very common, but as a formal absolute requirement for policing, police departments like to have the flexibility of being able to take somebody who doesn't have a bachelor's degree if they're otherwise qualified. Maybe they were in the military, maybe they had some training. So we don't see many police departments, it's much fewer than 10%, absolutely require a bachelor's degree as a minimum for employment, but a bachelor's degree is certainly preferred. And so they do look for people with bachelor's degrees. But nonetheless, what LEEP established was money so that people would be encouraged to go into policing, to study it in college, and if they got an LEEP grant, they wouldn't have to pay back the money if they worked in policing. Unfortunately for LEEP, the program wasn't managed very well, so many people who did not go into policing defaulted and never had to pay on those loans, and the government never collected the money. So there were a lot of problems with it, but nonetheless, it was a good start. And so it encouraged people to go to college to get their degree. Maybe these were people who were freshly out of the military, freshly from soldiers who had fought in Vietnam. They were able to use the money either through LEEP or through the military to go to college and get a degree. LEEP and other federal funding helped to spur on research into policing. We didn't have much research before the 1970s into policing. You saw studies here and there, but researchers really weren't attracted to policing in great numbers. Once the federal government dangled a bunch of money in front of them, then yes, researchers started to come. They're like anybody else. You put a pile of money in front of them, they're going to go towards that pile of money. And so suddenly people were more engaged into researching police, professors, researchers, scholars into researching the police. But it also caused federal funding was available to colleges and universities that established criminal justice programs. And it shouldn't surprise you that once Penn State saw some of this money, they jumped at it. and created the criminology program that we currently have right now, that this course is a part of. It can trace its roots back to the early 1970s and with this funding from the federal government. So LEAA certainly did a lot to improve our knowledge of the police and also the education of police officers. Now, as we transition from those three eras of policing and LEAA, there are certainly other police histories, and what we mean by that is not every police department in the United States followed the same trajectory through the political era to the professional areas, the community-oriented policing eras that we discussed in those previous PowerPoints. So we have other police histories, and what are those? Well, the oldest existing law enforcement agency is the Sheriff's Department. So you can trace the existence of the sheriff as an entity all the way back to Robin Hood and before. So the sheriff has been with us throughout many centuries. But the sheriff, even throughout history, really didn't do full law enforcement. A sheriff, often even back in Robin Hood's day, was more concerned with collecting taxes and doing those kinds of things. And we see that somewhat in the United States today. If you were in Pennsylvania, the sheriff's department doesn't really do full policing. What the sheriff's departments in Pennsylvania mainly do are administrative tasks, gun permits, transporting prisoners, guarding the jails, things like that. They're usually not out on patrol doing full law enforcement. You travel to the south or to the west, then you are more likely to see the sheriff's departments doing full law enforcement. My roommate from college worked in his first job with the Loudoun County, Virginia Sheriff's Department. So he did have to guard prisoners in the jail and work in the jail, but he also eventually did patrol. They were the full law enforcement agency for the county. So again, depends on where you go in the United States. You'll see differences in the sheriff's departments. So as I said, it's the oldest law enforcement agency still in existence, and as I just got done saying, the functions in the U.S. vary from state to state, from full law enforcement to mostly administrative details. A completely different history than the one we told with the political era and the professional era would be the slave patrols of the South in the 1800s. So these slave patrols weren't necessarily formal police departments, but they were comprised of maybe citizens who were banded together in a patrol. Maybe they might be paid by the masters, but obviously their job was, from their, as you can tell from their name, was to make sure that slaves were kept in check. If any slaves escaped, to track them down, to try to find them. If there was any wrongdoing, any threat of uprising, anything like that, the slave patrols were responsive to that. So obviously they were not devoted to equal law enforcement. Their job was to enforce the laws, the customs, the practices of slavery against the slaves, and not respecting any rights, generally speaking, of the slaves themselves. And so this can certainly have an impact on Southern policing, because Southern police departments will, at least in part, evolve from these Southern slave patrols, so they have a history from the origins of discrimination based on race. Western frontier policing, you couldn't have the same kind of policing out on the frontier in Wyoming and Montana and Colorado. Think of the old movies in the Westerns. You couldn't have that kind of policing that you had in the East because there weren't big cities. You didn't have factories and all the conveniences of life. You were in remote areas, and if you were a U.S. Marshal or a sheriff, you were the law for that area. And you were mostly on your own, and the law of the gun was probably more reality than fiction. This was rough justice. And so, in the western part of the United States today, you have that notion of independence in policing. That you were out there on the frontier by yourself, and you better be able to cope for yourself. So, a little bit different style of policing than a lot maybe different style of policing. Not as much today as it used to be, but certainly a different brand, more frontier justice than what we saw in the East. You also, in the United States, have seen vigilante groups from time to time. So these are private citizens who band together to deal with crime problems. So certainly, if we attach it to Western frontier policing, the posse. The sheriff might authorize people to be part of a posse to track down a particular criminal. But, in other times, other places, we also saw vigilantes who were protecting the community, saying police were not doing enough, so we need to protect on our own. Today we see, we tend to think of vigilantes as in the negative sense of the term, that they're lawless, that they're just out there, that it's the mob, it's mob rule. That doesn't have to be the case. We talked about in the first set of PowerPoint lectures, private police. Or actually I should say citizen police. Well, in citizen police, we still see this with neighborhood watches, people that are willing to go out and walk around their communities at night to make sure that everybody's safe or things are safe and those kinds of things. So there can be positive sides to the term vigilante, but usually we're not talking about vigilantes when we talk about neighborhood groups. They're more citizen police. Private police, we mentioned them previously and said there are various private agencies that conduct asset protection, so protecting property or protecting people, so bodyguards. And so, usually, oftentimes they're connected with industrial security. So now in the modern era, we have private police that are monitoring, they're doing cyber security. So really advanced, doing all kinds of investigations to prevent hacking and other kinds of problems. And we see this in other areas as well with corporations. They have their own investigators, their own private security. But we also see it with gated communities. They might hire private police instead of relying on public, et cetera, et cetera. The state police, Pennsylvania is proud to boast that it had the first full-service state police agencies. There were other state police agencies before, but they weren't full-service police agencies. Pennsylvania started in 1905, and their primary mission in 1905 was to stop strikes. So the strikers, the unions, had their thugs on their side. The industrialists usually paid for private police to counter them, but eventually they convinced the governor of Pennsylvania, Governor Pennypacker, to create the Pennsylvania State Police. It was a nice little plus for the industrialists because then they didn't have to pay for it. These police were paid for through tax money, and their job was basically to break strikes. And they've evolved into one of the most respected state police agencies, or just any police agency for that matter, in the United States. So they're very well respected today. Federal law enforcement, we're just going to briefly mention them. The U.S. Marshals are the oldest federal law enforcement agency. They've been around pretty much since the beginning of the United States. We have obviously the FBI, the DEA, many other agencies that do federal law enforcement. We see the growth of federal law enforcement because there's a growth in federal law in the 1900s. So you see more and more agencies, more and more people working in federal law enforcement, but the number of people working in federal law enforcement and the number of federal agencies is incredibly small compared to the number of people and the number of agencies that are devoted to state and local law enforcement. Typically, a federal law enforcement agency will have a very limited subject matter jurisdiction. They don't have jurisdiction over all laws at all times and all places. They have limits on what they can do. So even the FBI. The FBI is responsible for criminal investigations, intelligence work now as well, but they have their limits. So for instance, if there's an airplane crash, the FAA will investigate it, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the FBI won't be called in unless there's a suspicion that there's some kind of criminal activity, some kind of foul play. So even with federal law enforcement, with an institution like the FBI, there are limits to their authority. And so they're much more specialized than state and local law enforcement, generally speaking.